pay you the compliment to say that if your cause was worthy of your prowess, the result might be different. In all contests, though, the justice of a cause is not less an element of strength than the greatness of cannon and sharpness of steel. I bowed my acknowledgment of the compliment and indulged the hope that I might yet find some vulnerable point in the Iron Republic, if for nothing else than to redeem myself in the fair eyes that had witnessed my discomfiture. "I think you are entirely too magnanimous in Professor Defeat," said Miss Morris, taking part in the conversation for the first time and looking at me with her beautiful eyes beaming with interest. "If you are not too proud to accept an humble ally," I bowed again, "I venture to suggest that the enemy," smiling and flashing a glance at her father, "may attribute his victory, if indeed he has won it, to the fact that the fighting was all in his own territory where he was entrenched. It is my opinion that if I am worthy to be admitted to a council of war, that you run up the white flag too soon." "With the glorious prospect such a promising alliance opens to me," I replied facetiously, but with a peculiar thrill of gratification, "I hasten to pull down the flag of defeat and beg that you will advance into the breach." "Well," said my fair ally, "I reopened the attack by the assertion that it was not alone by bringing nations into closer intercourse that war has exerted a civilizing and elevating influence on the human mind. I believe that the highest and noblest thoughts of the peaceful present owe their origin to the high and noble deeds of a past made glorious by war." "Tut, tut!" exclaimed her father, "the romances of history and Sir Walter Scott have corrupted your mind." "Kindled, rather," retorted my ally, with a vigor that proved she was in earnest. "I acknowledge my indebtedness to history and Sir Walter, and when I read of the deeds of Coeur de Lion and Ivanhoe, even of Dalgetty and De Bracy, I cannot abide by the goodiness of a big nation like this that works and eats and slumbers like an ox. What would be the history of the world today if the Iron Republic had been founded on the Babylonian Empire and its principles had received worldwide acceptances? Try to think of a history of the world without an Alexander or Caesar or Frederick the Great or Bonaparte or Washington, without a Marathon or Thermopylae, without Crusades or Coeur de Lion." I was surprised at the energy with which these words were uttered, and suspected that the strong feeling that prompted them must have been long repressed. My host looked astonished, and Mrs. Morris turned to her daughter with a glance of concern, as though she had suddenly discovered in her traces of insanity. "The history of the world, my dear," said her father, after a moment's silence, "we may not alter or amend, and perhaps would not if we could. It is with the world's life as with a man's. The excesses, dissipations, and sins of early years cannot be blotted out, and the experience of them may even serve to enhance the virtues of a maturer age. Sometimes such experiences become the foundation of a nobler and more purposeful life, and then they may be recalled without regret. But it is a poor life that does not improve with age, and the world's life will be unrounded and incomplete if it is not profited by the knowledge and experience of the past. It is not in me to controvert these words so seriously and truly spoken, but with my new ally I was in the predicament of the man in the Indian fable, who made an alliance with the tiger, and found, after he had bound himself with thongs to that unconquerable beast, that he could not run away when he would. I trust you will not be angry with me, father, if I seem to dispute with you," replied Miss Helen with unyielding firmness. "But Can that have been wholly bad in the past, which is the source of all that is most beautiful in the present? What is the inspiration of poetry and all great thoughts but the high deeds which you impute to the recklessness of the world's youth? War is cruel, but does not its very cruelty provoke nobler sacrifices? As Mr. Barrington has said, and a more exalted heroism than the piping herdsman of Utopia ever dreamed of, and may it not be in the plan of creation that sunshine and storm, tears and laughter, love and hate, war and peace shall alternate like day and night to the end of time? My daughter, answered her father gravely, I am grieved at the low estimation in which you seem to hold your country, and that condition which has been the desire of the ages, but you are entitled to your opinions, and I would not have you repress them in deference to me. It is my faith, though, that the plan of creation contemplates the ultimate elimination of hate and strife and all evil whatsoever. And though he may not appeal to youth and a romantic imagination, the piping herdsman of Utopia, who tends his flocks and lives in peace, with clean hands and an upright heart, is to me a nobler example to God's creation than any else, than any medieval swashbuckler that ever drew sword or broke lance to win the silly fancy of a foolish lady love. To my mind, Professor Hallam, who would walk around a block rather than tread upon a worm, is a greater man than Coeur de Leon ever was, from every intelligent point of view. It may be wrong and wicked, cried the beautiful woman vehemently, with flashing eyes and flushed face, and if it is, I can't help it, and I don't care. But I am tired to death of this dreary monotony of peace and prosperity, and the ring of a spearhead upon the breastplate, or the clash of swords in a glorious cause, would make a sweeter music for me than all of the piping herdsmen of Utopia, or all the fiddlers of Ironia, for that matter. And bursting into tears, she rose hastily from the table and left the room. Well, I declare, exclaimed my host, pushing back his chair, who can solve the female enigma? I could not, but the one under consideration had gratified me exceedingly by her strange conduct, though I could not tell exactly why. It is said that women are past finding out, and I have never been a careful investigator, but without understanding it, the contemptuous reference to the fiddlers of Ironia braced me up immensely. With a woman's penetration, probably Miss Morris saw further into the matter than any of us, and saying something about girls' heads being filled with romance, she left the table also and followed her daughter from the room. The meal had been concluded some time before, and Miss Morris's unexpected departure, if the word may be used here, had very naturally put an end to the conversation. My host led the way, and we adjourned to the library. 10 or 15 minutes after leaving the dining room, we were made aware by the ringing of a gong that the carriage had arrived, and looking out, I saw a handsome vehicle with 2 seats besides the driver's standing at the door. My host called for the ladies, and they came down immediately. Miss Helen blushed as she entered with downcast eyes, kissed him on the cheek. "How now, my young renegade, what means this treason to your country?" he exclaimed, holding her face between his hands and looking at her with mock severity. "It simply means that the country is all right, ma Pierre, but that I am not ready for the millennium," she replied, smiling faintly, and with that she turned on me a glance that made my heart bound, and I mentally snapped my fingers at the fiddlers of Ironia. There was something in that glance which said plainer than words that there was a bond between us, and the alliance would be continued. She was attired for the drive in a blue flannel gown buttoned to the throat like an English riding habit with jaunty cap and gloves to match. Her mother was similarly dressed in a dark brown suit, and without delay we passed out to the carriage. As we stood by the carriage while my host was giving the motor maw directions as to the course of drive, Mrs. Morris remarked that I had best sit on the back seat with the professor, as looking forward it gave a better opportunity for observation. The seats faced each other, and whether it was by accident or design, I hoped the latter, her mother had no sooner spoken the words than Miss Helen stepped forward and placed her foot on the step to enter the carriage. I helped her in and helped her mother in after her, and then at another lightning-like flash of those wonderful eyes which conveyed more meaning than any mere words. I entered the carriage and took my seat opposite her. Professor Morris followed, taking his seat by my side, and as I looked into the face of the peerless woman before me, so chaste and beautiful, with just the suggestion of a fine scorn in the curve of the exquisitely chiseled mouth and drooping eyelids, I felt that but for the presence of others I must have fallen on my knees before her. If Cupid had let me pass through all the years before unscathed, he was atoning for his dereliction by a most extraordinary display of archery, for with every glance of those glorious eyes an arrow seemed to quiver in my heart. Never having experienced this sentiment, sensation, or whatever it is, of love, my resources in that direction were untouched, and I came to it like a strong man to a race. I had known this woman less than 2 days, and already I felt as though I had known and loved her for years. So impressed upon my heart was every feature of her face, and every speaking glance of those marvelous, unfathomable eyes. Indeed, by some strange consciousness it began to dawn upon me that I had looked upon that face and into those eyes before. Was there truth in the theosophical philosophy of Plato, or had I seen her in a dream? It seemed incredible to me that I had looked upon her for the first time only the day before. It could not be. I could not be in so short a time have become so familiar with every lineament and every changing expression of quick intelligence. When we left my friend's door, we did not go towards the capital, but in another direction, through streets I had not seen before. The houses were unpretentious as a rule, built of brick and stone. Mostly everywhere there was an appearance of comfort without ostentation. We passed through miles of shaded streets by fountains and monuments, through parks and pleasure grounds, finding everywhere beauty, cleanliness, and evidence of prosperity. We passed houses of the most distinguished men of the nation, including those of the President, members of the Supreme Cabinet, and others eminent for their achievements in the field of science and letters, and there was no noticeable difference between them and the residences of ordinary citizens. This seemed to be no aristocratic quarter, and when I proposed to turn through the slums and succeeded in making myself understood, I was informed that there was no slums and nothing corresponding to them. Have you then reached the ideal social state where you have no poor? I asked. We have at least reached that ideal social state where we have no rich, answered the professor. Indeed, do you mean to say that you have no wealthy class at all? More, replied my host, that we have no wealthy person at all. What? I exclaimed. Not a single rich man in the entire republic? Not a single rich man, woman, or child in the entire republic, and never can be, was the answer. I shall not argue about this, I remarked after a few minutes' reflection, and whether or not it is a desirable condition, it is certainly a peculiar one for a country like this, that seems to be blessed not only with material resources of every description, but with the skill and energy to utilize them to the last degree. Will you explain to me why is it in such a country a man of industry and good judgment does not grow rich as elsewhere in the world? For the same reason that a man does not lift himself over a stile by the straps of his boots, answered the professor facetiously, simply because it is a feat of impossible accomplishment. But why? The conditions seem to be most favorable. In the first place, said the professor, if it were not for debt, interest, and unearned increment, men could not become rich even were they not restrained. And in the second place, here, where we have none of the evils, we anticipate the possibility of such a thing as legislation which renders it impossible. But that is what I wish to understand. How do you evade these evils, as you call them, on one hand, and anticipate them on the other? Well, replied the professor, besides having no debt, interest, or unearned increment, which condition itself is a bar to wealth, we have a graduated income tax which would reach the point of confiscation before even moderate wealth, according to your standards, is attained. For instance, all incomes above 800 dioms are taxed 10%, and 10% for every additional 400 dioms, which limits the income to 4,400 dioms. For at that point the tax takes hold. You see, this tax limits incomes to a possible sum of 1,200 dioms. But I said, without asking it argumentatively, how can you, who are such a stickler for justice in the abstract, justify this confiscation of a man's property when, as you claim, your system is so perfect that it cannot be acquired by dishonest methods? Theoretically, it is unjust, assented the professor, but the object of a truly enlightened government is not so much to vindicate any ethical code as to secure the happiness and welfare of its citizens. If a particular bull should grow horns so much longer than the rest of the herd as to put it at its mercy, he should be dehorned, although it might seem cruel, not because he had acquired his weapons unjustly, but because having them puts him in his power to be unjust. We have ideal political conditions, and I cannot conceive how a man with any amount of money here could use it to the detriment of others. But you remember Alexander's boast that no city was impregnable to him, into which he could introduce an ass laden with gold. When you stated just now that you had no such things as debt, interest, and unearned increment, I remarked, I take it that you intended to convey the idea that these were practical nullities above the limit fixed by your income tax. Below that limit, I presume, a man may use his money in the way that will yield the largest returns. He may use it in any legitimate way, was the answer. That is, he may buy commodities or employ labor or engage in any enterprise that does not conflict with the statutes. My statement, though, was absolutely true. There is no such thing as debt, interest, and unearned increment, even in the most limited sense. Then you have no credit system at all? I asked. Our people do not know the meaning of the word credit when applied to commercial transactions, replied the professor. A man cannot become a debtor or a creditor because the law does not recognize any such conditions. The nearest approach to it is the binding force of contracts, but the statutes have been so carefully framed that the obligations of contracts cannot be made to partake of the nature of debt. There being no such thing as debt, there cannot, of course, be no such thing as interest. And as by the national exchange system nothing can be sold for more than the average cost of production, one man cannot make much money off another man's labor. It seems then that one object of your government is to keep the people poor. The object, answered the professor, is not to keep the people poor, but to keep them in such a condition of equality that one class cannot take advantage of another. But wealth and poverty are purely relative terms, and cannot be said that the object is any more to keep them all poor than to make them all rich. And when I said that we had no rich people, I meant according to your standard and that of the old world. In the truest sense, our people are for the most part all rich, having a country abounding with resources of every kind which have been utilized and being protected from taxes, interest, and every form of oppression that could rob them of the fruits of their labor. And do you mean to say that you have no taxes either? I asked credulously. Practically none, my friend answered. We have a graduated income tax, but only in theory, as there is an opportunity for its application, and it was only enacted to guard against unforeseen contingencies. There is a tax, too, on all unused land of 5%, of what is capable of producing, that being what the state would get from it if it was cultivated. But as this results in the government owning all of the unused land, and as any citizen can take possession of and hold all that he can use free of charge to himself, his heirs, and assignees forever, that tax is practically inoperative. Really? I exclaimed. The more I learn, I am amazed, but if you have no taxes, tell me how this model of government is supported. Well, the Bureau of Subsistence and the Department of Public Utilities supply the means necessary for the expenses of the government, answered the professor. Will you explain to me how this is done? I asked. It certainly must be a very complicated system. Oh, on the contrary, replied the professor, it is so extremely simple that every merchant and farmer in your country puts it in practice in the conduct of his business. Freight and passenger tariffs on the railroads, canals and navigable rivers, and lighting, power, telephone, and express services. Franchises yield the Department of Public Utilities and sufficient sum, together with the profits derived from the national exchange system, to meet all the expenses of the government. I see, said I. The profits of all this business goes to the government. Yes, to the government, answered my friend, for to use a fiction of this kind is a convenient way to express the aggregate ownership of the people. I can see but one difficulty, I remarked, and that is in adjusting these tariffs and profits, as it is impossible to tell what they will yield. Oh, that presents no difficulties, was the reply, as the tariffs and percentages for the ensuing year are based on the expenses of the government for the year before. For instance, the total cost of operating the government last year was about 200 million dimes, of which about 5.5 millions are used in defraying the expenses of the government proper, and the balance in operating its exchanges and utilities. Assuming that the business of these departments will be the same this year as last, it is a simple arithmetical problem to fix the tariffs to raise the necessary amount. As a matter of fact, though, in making up the budget for any year, a very liberal margin is allowed, and the excess thus accruing is expended by the Department of Progression in scientific experimentation and new utilities. You say the actual cost of government last year, outside of running the railroads, exchanges, and other utilities, was about 5.5 million dimes? So what is a dime? Well, a dime is the value of a day's work and is the unit of our financial system. It is about the value of an American dollar. And what is the population of the Republic? Well, a little over 50 million. That seems incredible, I said. And 50 million people can be governed for this sum, and... Say served for this sum, interrupted the professor. Well, served for that sum, and I cannot understand it in any other light. than that your people have advanced to a higher plane of intelligence and morality than the people of other countries. It may be said without egotism that they have advanced to somewhat higher plane of intelligence, said the professor, for the results of it are here to show. But I do not think that they are any better morally. Morality and religion is the surplus crop here, as in America and everywhere else. They do not rob and oppress because they have combined for mutual protection against each other. The entire government seems to be run on the principles of a great trust or corporation, I remarked. Well, that's exactly what it is, replied my friend. It is the logical end and culmination of trusts and monopoly. It is a trust formed of the whole people for purposes of government, commerce, transportation, education, and everything else that is pertaining to the welfare. The cost of the entire system in all its branches, operative, legislative, judicial, educational, and penal, amounts to an impost of about 5% on commerce, while the tariffs for transportation and other public utilities probably does not exceed one half of what they are in countries dominated by wealth. I had never had any commercial training, but I knew that it cost all the way from 10 to 100% of the value of any product in the United States to get it out of the hands of the producer and into those of the consumer. What is the total business of this vast trust in all branches? I asked. Something like 4 billion dimes, replied the professor. So 50 million people in one great trust, and that so organized and safeguarded that no member could ever take advantage of another. I could scarcely conceive of such a thing, but it was extremely simple in theory, and there it was in successful operation right before my eyes. I'm beginning to comprehend something of your wonderful scheme of government, I remarked, but as one of the first things I learned after leaving my ship was that you do not use metal money as a medium of exchange. I am curious to learn something of your financial system. How does your medium of exchange originate, and what is it based on? I believe, said the professor, without answering my question, that our financial system is as near perfect as anything of human origin can be. And do you not think your whole government scheme is perfect? I asked in surprise. No, indeed, replied my friend. It is ideal in comparison with what has been accomplished in the world before, but the final perfect government is no government at all. Why, Professor, you cannot mean anarchy, I exclaimed. Oh, no, he answered, just no government. When people become fully civilized and Christianized, and that narrow delusion called patriotism gives place to a worldwide fraternalism, there will be no necessity for government or laws. Oh, for goodness sake, I cried, leave something for heaven and hereafter, but this monetary system, tell me something about that. It is all comprehended in these propositions, said the professor. The value of anything is what it is worth to a man, and it is honestly worth to one man what it cost another man to produce it. Value in a medium of exchange can only adhere when that medium is a commodity of intrinsic worth, or when it represents such a commodity, and then its value is exactly of the article it represents. Very well, go on, I said. Where there are no exchangeable commodities of value, there can be no honest medium of exchange because there is no exchangeable commodity for itself to represent. Here the value of everything is based on the average cost of production, and when it passes out of the hands of the producer, he is entitled to its value and anything else he may want. In a crude state of society, this exchange is effected by bartering one article for another directly, or by converting them into pieces of metal or other unscientific forms of, quote, money of uncertain or arbitrary value, and using it as a medium of exchange. But this medium is an uncertain quantity depending on the discovery of mines, the vagaries of legislation, and the manipulation of the financiers who own and control it. Commerce in all commodities becomes a mere shuttlecock in the hands of the money masters, and the value of everything in their medium is subject to their will. Under such conditions, it is not strange that in a country where plenty is produced for all, a few roll in wealth and luxury while many suffer for the actual comforts of life. It is not strange either that those who control the money are the ones that roll in wealth, while those who do all the work and produce all the commodities grovel in want. This is the result of ignorance on the part of the producing masses, and is about on a par with that fabled transaction